programs, and it plays really nicely formatting and uploading into those stats programs for you. A REDCap project database has 4 main phases. Development, where you're creating and editing your database forms and doing all of your testing. Production, this is where you're doing all of your data collection. Analysis and cleanup, so this is when data collection has stopped and you still want to be able to access the data to do analysis, but it locks down data entry a little bit. You can choose whether or not any modification of the data is allowed at this point, or you can just freeze everything and have it solely available for review and analysis. And then finally, completed. And this just removes it from your list of project databases and makes a project inaccessible. Both analysis and completed projects can be returned to production. The benefit of marking something as completed, once you start having a lot of projects in the system, it can be nice to have them removed from your main list of projects so that you're not constantly looking at them and trying to sort past them. And then I wanted to throw out a few best practices to think about when you're creating your database. So when you're creating your variables, the very first variable is your subject or your record ID, and that has to be the first variable on the first form. REDCap won't let you do anything else. And then your variable names are alphanumeric, underscores instead of spaces, no special characters of any kind. And you want to keep them on the short and sweet side. So it's always a balance trying to find a variable name that is meaningful, but that you're not going to hate yourself for writing when you have to write out 20 different times to do your analysis. But this is using DOB instead of date of birth, for instance. Some things to make data entry go well, where you can use a drop-down or a multiple choice question instead of having to type out text answers every single time. I think anyone who's done data entry for hours on end remembers how you get to the end and you're just exhausted, and then you go back through and you realize you've spelled the word aspirin 7 different ways over the course just as a simple typo. Where you can, multiple choice questions help cut down on data cleaning that you have to do after the fact. Not everything can be multiple choice though. Things like name, ages, dates probably don't make good multiple choice questions, but you can validate them to say that only a specific kind of data can be put in that text field. So if someone tries to type out a word as a number in word form instead of in numerical form, it can pop up an error and have them enter it correctly to make your analysis a lot easier. Keep your similar variables together and break them up into separate forms, and keep your forms on the short side. There are 2 reasons to do this. One of them is mental fatigue. So I think everybody's tried to fill out that online questionnaire that just scrolls like 150 questions down. It's a lot easier on us mentally to fill out 15 forms of 10 questions than it is to fill out one really long form of 150. It also cues you to save more often. REDCap doesn't save as you're typing, it saves when you hit the save button. And part of the HIPAA compliance is it will time you out if you haven't interacted with the server in a certain amount of time, for example, changing pages or hitting the save button. So it's possible to enter 149 variables, step away, take a break, and come in and find yourself that you missed the logout warning and you've been logged out and lost the data. Only something that really has to happen to you once before you start breaking the forms up to help encourage more frequent saving. This is pretty constant in medical research, but mark your identifiers, strip them from the data before exporting unless they're absolutely necessary in that export. And then there's always the question of calculations. REDCap can handle some fairly complex calculations, but it can also get pretty complicated trying to get everything to work the way you want it to. The general rule of thumb I give people is, if this is a calculation you need to have for data entry purposes, maybe you need to know someone's BMI so that they can determine what set of questions they get, keep that sort of calculation in your database. If this is just something you want to know for analysis purposes, wait and handle it on the back end. REDCap is designed to interface really well with the major stats packages. It's not designed to emulate them. And also, if you're working with a professional statistician, they're probably going to rerun any calculation you have in the project anyways, just to make sure that everything is done correctly and the way they want it. So resources when you're building your REDCap project. In every REDCap project, there is a Contact the Administrator button. REDCap also has a fairly extensive, although not necessarily incredibly well organized FAQ that has a lot of resources for a huge range of the questions that will come up as you're building your project. And then in a bit of a self-plug here, I have a link to the videos that I've developed that go over all the main parts of developing a REDCap project. And I think all of the different topics that'll be covered next week as well, or tomorrow as well, in terms of things like repeating instruments, alerts, e-consent, a lot of those special, more detailed features. So this is what it will look like when you log into a REDCap project. I'm on the University of Colorado instance, so you might see things are just a little bit different here. You probably won't have this big box at the top, but everything else is pretty much the same. You have all your welcome information, contact an admin button. REDCap will give you a list of your projects. So it'll tell you how many records, how many fields, if it's surveys or regular data entry forms, if it's what we call a basic project or longitudinal. And the wrench means that it's a project that's still in development. The checkbox means that it is a project that has been moved to production. And you can organize your projects into as many different folders as you want. And then you can just select a folder, choose what project you want to add to it. And you can put a project in more than one folder if it seems to fit more than one category, and that's what's going to make sense for your organizational system. I will come right back to this one. I mentioned the help and FAQ. Huge long list of questions here on a wide range of categories that you're going to be addressing. I particularly like using the FAQ when it comes to things like calculated fields or any place where I'm not sure about logic or syntax. So for instance, if I'm trying to figure out how to calculate the difference between the two dates, I will often come back and reference the FAQ here just to make sure that I have everything in the right order and that I haven't mixed up, for example, capital M for months and lowercase m for minutes. These training videos are linked in every version of REDCap. These are developed by Vanderbilt University, and they go through the basic process of how to use a REDCap database. And then finally, circle back to building a new project. Every REDCap project has to have a title, and then you're going to select a purpose for it. A lot of the projects are going to probably be research, and for those, you don't need all of this information to get started, but you probably will want to fill it in eventually. It's a really helpful resource to have in the documentation of a project life to know that anyone who opens a project can see who the PI is and contact them if they need to, or reference the IRB number. On our campus, this really comes into play when I get an email saying there's nobody left on this project I need access to that can add me to it. But I really need access to that data. It tells me who I can go back to, who I should be asking, is this person legitimately needing access to this data, and do I have formal permission to grant it? You do have to specify a type of research before you can move on, but it is not something that needs to be set in stone at this point. As you're building the project, you can assign to a project folder, and you can add notes. The notes are for metadata, any kind of data that tells you something about the project overall. So a good example of when you would use notes would be if you have yearly databases, you could explain that this database is copied off of previous year's database and then modified in certain fields, so that someone coming down the line in 6 months or a year who can't talk to you understands the exact progression through. Or if you make a copy database just to test things out in, you probably want to make sure that's clearly labeled both in the project title and in the project notes so nobody tries to put real data in it. And then you can choose how to start your project. So you can create an empty project. You can upload a REDCap project XML file. So if someone has shared a REDCap project with you as a file, they've probably shared it as an XML file that you can just upload, and it will recreate the entire database that they shared with you, with or without data, depending on the XML that they shared. Or you can use a template, and these vary a little bit by institution, but REDCap has some basic ones that come for that everybody can check out. I highly recommend the field embedding project template personally as a really good one if you're going to be using that. But then you would just make your selections and hit create project, and it will take you into the project itself. And I am actually going to jump to an already created project so that you can see the demo. So this is what the inside of the REDCap database looks like. While your project's in development, your landing page is going to be this project setup page. This is what you're going to be referencing constantly as you're building the project. Once you are in production, your landing page is going to be this project homepage that lists out the users, statistics on the project, and lets you know if there are any upcoming calendar events. You also have the other functionality page. So this is where you would mark the project as completed, or if it were in production, I would be able to mark it to move to analysis cleanup, delete the project, and erase data. These are usually, when you are in development, you can usually do them on your own. When you're in production, they usually require an administrator, just to make sure that you don't accidentally delete a project that you had real data in and desperately needed. You can make a copy of the project. I love making copies of projects that are in production so that I can test out new things I want to do with them or troubleshoot problems without worrying about messing up someone's actual data set, or even better, triggering a cascade of invitations to participants that shouldn't have gone out. And then I mentioned the XML files, and this is where you can download a copy of those that you can use as a backup for yourself or use to share the project with someone else. You're sharing the file of the project, it's not a linked version. And then we have the project revision history. This is something really cool that REDCap does. When you are in development, you can take snapshots as you're building your database, and it will save a copy of that data dictionary. So if you make a huge range of changes that you don't want to continue, that you want to roll back, if you've taken a snapshot, you can just go back to that previous snapshot and get rid of those changes. Once you're in production, every time you submit and have changes to the data dictionary approved, it will save a copy of that automatically for you every single time. So you have draft versions of every single change you've made to the project. This is also really helpful in terms of if you ever need to roll back changes when you're in production. Most of the changes you make to the data dictionary can be rolled back just by rolling back to a different version. So if you delete a field out of the project, if you re-add that field back in with the same variable name, the data attached to it will reappear. It wasn't actually deleted out of the backend servers. So if a field is accidentally deleted and it's in production, so we have the previous version, or they took a snapshot, we can add that field back in, all their data comes back, an accidentally deleted field isn't a big deal. The project setup page is where you do most of the building in a project. So this is where you choose if you want the project to use surveys, if you want it to be longitudinal, if you need to come back and add or change some of this information I talked about earlier, or put in notes. I'm going to come back to designing the data collection instruments. That's a huge section in and of itself. Enable optional modules and customizations. So these are little extra things you can do on your REDCap project on the project level to add some extra functionality. You can make an instrument repeating so that, for instance, instead of having to write out 20 different potential medication fields that somebody might need, you can just write out the fields you need for one medication. So start date, stop date, dose, and then have people just click add another each time they want to add another medication, or for visit information, just have people add another visit date organically, not having to guess what the total number is going to be for everybody. You can do randomization in REDCap. This is somewhat limited in terms of its flexibility, and it does require you to supply the randomization tables. If this is something you're interested in doing, I really recommend talking to a statistician about the possibility and how they would recommend going about doing it. They are by far the most qualified people to say if this is probably a good idea for your project or not. I mentioned the ability to potentially send survey invitations via SMS text message. This is institution by institution. But it's something, if your institution allows it or the institution you're working with allows it, you'd be able to enable it here. You can also set custom record labels or have a secondary unique field. By default, everything is ordered by the record ID, but if you want to, you can change it so it is ordered by something else. And this custom record label, it will display a little bit of extra information next to the record ID, so it can make it easier to search through a project. The field comment log allows you to make notes on the data entry that you're doing in terms of why you may put in data the way it is, and it allows other people to see those notes, potentially respond to it. It can help track why decisions were made inside of a project. You can all REDCap forms can be downloaded as PDFs, and you can customize some ways of doing it. Missing data codes is for tomorrow. So yeah, just a lot of really interesting little things here. Hide the Today Now button on forms and surveys. Just a lot of interesting things you can do on the project level in here. Project bookmarks are exactly what they sound like. They are bookmarks to places in the same project or places on the internet in general. User rights is how you determine who's going to be able to access your project. So you need to make sure that the person's REDCap username is displayed in the box. Otherwise, it's not going to link. If you just display their name or put in their email, that's not going to link to their account. It has to actually be their REDCap username. And then you can add with custom rights. So here you can choose how long they have access to your project. And then we have these three really high-level setup pieces. Project design and setup rights grants people the right to go in and make any changes they want to or need to your database. So they can add fields, remove them, do survey setup, anything like that. Because of that, you want to be really careful who you give this to, because if it's someone who doesn't know the project that well or doesn't know REDCap that well, they can do a fair amount of damage. But if it's someone who needs to be building forms for you or helping with actual project design in any way, they're probably going to need to be able to access this right. User rights is the ability to add and remove people from the project and to control what they can do within the project. Again, this is a really high-level user right that can it can create a lot of security risks if someone is added with way too many rights, and it can create a lot of frustration if someone isn't given the rights that they need. So be careful about who you grant these abilities to. Data access groups, the ability to control them. This is used on multi-site projects where you want sites to only be able to see their own data. So data access group rights here are the ability to control what the groups are on the project and who is in what group. When it comes to data exports, you can choose if people have the no ability to export data at all, if they can do the full data set. And then we have two different de-identification options here. The de-identified that's checked by default means that any free-form text field, so any text field that isn't validated, is removed, as well as, and then all date time fields are going to be time shifted, so they don't match up easily to a specific date. And anything you've marked as an identifier is stripped. This removes all tagged identifiers field. That just removes anything that you have set as an identifier, but not necessarily a regular free-form text field that hasn't been flagged. Calendar is the REDCap calendar. Unfortunately, it doesn't link really well to Outlook or Google Calendars or anything like that. It's kind of a static item inside of REDCap. Data import tool is the ability to import data en masse, usually from a CSV file. Data comparison tool is the ability to put two records side by side and see what the differences are. Logging is every single action you take in REDCap is logged with who did it, when they did it, and exactly what the action was, specifically in terms of how it may have affected data. So the logging right is the ability to go in and access those logs. Really helpful for if you need to trace down problems or figure out why data may have changed. Not something every single person on your project needs to be playing around with. You can't change the log. That cannot be done. But it's still not something necessarily everybody needs to be using. The file repository is the ability to store files in REDCap. Usually, so this is things like a backup copy of your data set or an SOP, things that you might want to have all in the same place, easily accessible to all the users on your project, stored in a secure environment of REDCap. Data quality tools are just little rules that you can run that will help you see if, for instance, you have fields have data that's been entered outside of the expected ranges, items like that. APIs are the ability to programmably move data in and out of REDCap, and the ability to use those is institutionally dependent. Similarly with the mobile app, which allows for offline data collection on a mobile device. For data entry purposes, the ability to create records, virtually everybody needs. Renaming records is a little bit more rare, and the ability to just delete a record. If you delete a record, it doesn't delete it from the log. It just deletes it out of the data set. You can lock records also so that people can't go back and change the data that's already been entered. And then over here, you have the ability to control on a form-by-form basis whether or not someone can access it. So you can say that someone has no access to a particular form, read-only or read-write. And the really useful place for this is often when you're working with sensitive data, only a couple of people need to have access to those identifiers. So you could put all your identifiers on one form, lock it so that most people have no access to it, and only a couple of people can access those forms and see that sensitive information. That can be kind of exhausting to do if you are lucky enough to have a whole cohort of minions doing data entry for you to go and set that up individually for 20 people. So there's the ability to create a role in the project. There's the ability to create a role in the project and just set what user rights people in that role can have. And then if you're adding a lot of people who all need the same user rights, you can just assign them to that role that you've created with a couple of clicks instead of having to go through that entire exhaustive process with every single person. I mentioned data access groups briefly. This is a really useful thing for multi-site projects where you only want each site to see their own data. You just create your group. and then you say what users you want to assign to that group. And they will only be able to see the data entered by them and other people in their group. They just won't see any of the other data at all. Anyone outside of a data access group can see everything. So that would be your project administrators getting access to, who have access to everything, and then most people being assigned to a specific group in a multi-site project. And occasionally you have people working at more than one site. I see this a lot with working with different health centers, where someone might be working at more than one local health center, depending on the day. So you can assign people to more than one DAG if you need to, and they can switch back and forth. The next step on the list is to test the project thoroughly. Please test your project before you start putting in real people's data. Make sure that everything's working the way you want it to work, that everything makes sense. If you can, have people from different parts of your project test it. Have your data entry people enter a record and make sure everything makes sense to them. Have your statistician take a look and see if they notice something that's going to cause them hours of headaches and you a lot of money when they try to do the analysis. Test your project exhaustively. It doesn't matter how many fake records you put it in, because when you're ready to move to production, you can choose to just delete them all out. So what I'm going to do next is show you what it looks like to do a piece of data entry so you can see what the form looks like on its own. And then we'll go back and look at the online designer to see how that form is created. So data entry, you can go to the record status dashboard, where there'll be a list of all the projects, or add edit records. And then we have a basic test item. So this field's been validated as a number. If I try to enter text, it's going to give me an error. I cannot proceed without changing that item. Here it's giving me a different error. I said that I expected age to be within a certain range. I've entered a number outside of that. This is what we call a soft validation. It will let me go ahead with it to allow for the existence of outliers, but it's not going to be, but it's giving me this error message to let me know that I might want to go back and double check to see if I have a typo in there of some kind. And once I have an acceptable value, I can keep moving forward. REDCap allows for drop-down menus, radio buttons where you can just pick one. And you notice here we have piping going through. So whatever item I pick in this multiple choice question is showing up down here. So I'll show you how to do that as we build the data entry form. Slider fields, these are always on a scale of 1 to 100, but they work really well in a test-retest situation where people might remember pretty easily that they said where they said something was on a scale of 1 to 10, they'll be less likely to remember where they dropped a slider. Checkbox questions, so that's your pick all that you want to. And then you can have a matrix of fields. So this is your Likert scales, where you have a set of questions that all have the same answer choices. You can upload pictures, link to videos, upload an audio file, upload a document that your participants can see or potentially download. Yes, no questions. Give people the ability to upload their own documents. So if you want them to scan and upload a signed consent form, you can provide a place for them to do that. And you can do an e-signature, and that is the best I can do with a mouse, but it saves it in line with the rest of the data entry. So that's what it looks like when you have built that's what it looks like when it's built. Building it, you're mostly going to do in the online designer. So in the online designer, you can create a new instrument. you can import from the REDCap shared library, and this is a fabulous resource. If you're using an instrument that is really common, try searching for it in the REDCap library, and you might have to try a few times to figure out exactly how it's in there. I'm not going to say it's the best search mechanism in the world, but if I need a Spanish version of the PHQ, I can download it and import it directly into my project. And a lot of popularly used forms are available in that library, and they've gone through a validation process to make sure that they were appropriately changed from their paper form to a REDCap compatible form. And also the committee that manages that goes back to the authors and makes sure they have copyright permissions for these forms to be in the library and for you to be using them. They also have a lot of the promised computer adaptive tests in there that you can import into your project as well. If you're sharing forms between REDCaps or between projects, you can download them as a zip and upload them directly into the project, and it will just recreate the form as well. But a lot of the time you're building from scratch. So for a text field, you have a drop-down menu with all the different types of fields that you can put in the project. Text fields are where people are just going to be typing in their own information. The field label is what shows up when you're doing data entry. The variable name is what is actually stored as the name of the variable in the backend databases. That's what the data is actually attached to, and it's really the more important piece in terms of keeping data actually in the project. You can validate any text field and say that it is a date, time, email, number to a certain decimal place, phone number, and that just forces people to do that kind of data entry. You can make it required and mark it as an identifier. This makes it easy to strip out when you're exporting. You can change how it aligns, so I could move this to be on the left. And then field notes are small reminder texts that gets displayed underneath the field. So this is a great place to say, like, enter weight in kilograms to specify units for somebody, or to tell them where to go look up a piece of information. And then we have this action tag field annotations. Action tags I'm going to leave as a teaser for tomorrow. They're a great way to really affect the functionality of any individual field. Field annotation, again, this is a place for metadata. If there's any extra information that you want to have recorded about this variable that you do not want to show up to the people doing data entry or to your survey participants, this is where you put it. So this is the field that was validated as a number and wouldn't let me put in the text. So you can see I have the validation on it. And then you can see where I set that date range or age range that the number had to fall in to not get a warning. It did let me go ahead, but it gave me a warning that I was outside of range. Next type of field we're going to look at is a drop-down menu. So this is one of your multiple choice options. Field label, again, what the data enterer sees, variable name, how the project is actually stored, or how the field is actually stored. And then you have your answer choices. And these are just anything before the comma, so this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's how those answer choices are being stored in the database. And then this red, blue, yellow, that is what you'll see when you do data entry. Because this is what's stored, it gets a little bit, one thing we never recommend you do is come back in and start renumbering your data. If I try and do this, anything that I entered as 3 yellow It's now labeled as white. Anything that was entered as for purple is now labeled as black. I've just changed the meaning of the data I've already entered by trying to put in my new answer choices. I can still add answer choices and I can put them anywhere I want to on the list, but I never want to change those numbers. I want to leave them the way they were. And I went up to 6, so I'm just going to add them with new codes, 7 and 8. And type correctly so that it doesn't warn me that I'm trying to put in duplicates. So now these new values, they'll show up where I want them to in the list, but they're not changing the meaning of any data. They have their own unique codes. And they're available for data entry purposes. You can also add, if you want, NA or other fields so that people have more general options. And we'll play with tomorrow ways to connect text field to that other so that people can specify, and how to make those standardized codes across the project. So your slider field is just a slider field type. You can put you get to choose what you want the labels to be. And then the slider field is always on a scale of 0 to 100. We can't change it, unfortunately, but you can choose if you want the number they see to display or not. This is also where I had that example of piping. So how I was doing that is the variable name on my radio button question is genre. All I have to do to have the information that was entered in that genre question show up in somewhere else in the project is take that variable name and put it inside of square brackets. Anytime I do that, it's going to pull whatever I had entered into that field and show it here. And I apologize if there's a little background noise. That's working from home sometimes. Checkbox fields are set up just like a radio button or a drop-down field would be. Matrix fields are created a little bit differently. When you want to create a matrix, instead of clicking this Add Field button to pop this up, you're going to click Add a Matrix of Fields. And you can put the question or any instructions in the header. And then really, it's just a series of regular questions. So I have, this is my series of questions, the same field labels and the same variable names we were using. But they all have the same set of answer choices that people are selecting from that will display across the top. You don't actually have to have a label on any of those answer choices. I can put in a blank one if I want to in the middle. These can be radio buttons or checkboxes. And I can also choose to rank them. So if I didn't want it, if I decided that I don't have any real data in here yet, and what I actually want is not for them to say for each individual one how much they like it, but to rank them all. I can do that. I give my matrix a name. And now if I did data entry, I'd only be able to click one answer choice in each of these columns. So it forces people to pick one answer per question and not to repeat any of those values. I do not know what its problem is there, so I will demonstrate with by creating another one. A descriptive field is really an open playground for you. The field label could just be text that you put in with instructions or a warning or extra information. You can link to a YouTube video if you want to. I do not know what that video is. Or you can upload a file that you want people to see. So this is, I could grab any file I wanted to on my computer. and have it display as a link or as an inline image, or if it were an audio file, I'd be able to play an embedded player on the page. So this would be how this this link would display, and this is how the inline image displays. Then we have these yes, no, and true, false fields. And I really don't recommend using them. The good parts about them are that they have standardized answer choices so that it's always 1 yes, 0 no, and that is wonderful and perfect. You want to be, anytime you're using the same set of answer choices, you want to make sure they're coded the same way. And 1 yes, 0 no, or 1 true, 0 false, that's pretty standard in terms of data science standards and how you would label those. The problem comes if you want to add a third answer choice to this. I can't add anything here, it's not modifiable, so I have to go up and make radio buttons, and my answer choices just went away. So it's really easy for me now to go in and do this. So all of a sudden, all of my yes choices are going to be read as no's. All of my no's are gone. And then I've added a new yes field that has no existing data in it from all the previous yes fields, along with my other field. That obviously gives you the chance to make a lot of really bad changes to your project by accident, just not realizing you've changed how your answer choices were coded. I recommend just starting with a multiple choice field, and to be consistent, you can copy existing answer choices from another question. I don't have any other yes/no questions here, but I could pull, it's nonsensical, but I could pull my color answers into this if I wanted to. All the coding would be the same and consistent. The file upload field is just the field label and variable name, and it lets people upload their own file. And similarly with the e-signature field, it's just the field label and variable name and lets people add their signature. And there really are very similar types of field where they both are functionally just the person doing data entry, uploading information about them. And then the last thing I want to show you with the online designer is this ability to create a snapshot. So when I was showing you that project revision history earlier, I said you could take a snapshot. That's how you do it. It has now stored a snapshot of that database so that if I make changes in the future and want to come back to how it is right at this second, I can do that because I've saved a copy of it. So that's how you get data into REDCap. That's how you build the form and get data in. The next step is the ability to get data out. And so that's going to be using the data exports, reports, and stats feature. So I'm going to show this from creating a report because all of these other options are available with my report data and in the exact same way as they are with the entire data set. REDCap reports are useful, but they aren't as sophisticated as you might do in some other database programs. What I'm essentially going to be able to do is pick a subset of my data to look at. So I have to give it a name. Again, putting in a description. This is metadata explaining what the contents of this report are supposed to be. And then you can choose who can access it and who can edit it in your project. There are a bunch of different ways to add fields. You can do just quick checks, or you can put in an entire instrument, or you can select from a list, or you can type in the variable names. However is most convenient to how you happen to be putting things together. And then I can add filters so that not everybody gets pulled into my project. So I only want people with the first name Amanda to show up in my report. I can change this so that I was only pulling people with birthdays before a certain time point, or whose age, or who are over a certain age. And I can combine those with and or statements to make really complex filters that I put on my report. And if this filter option is This filter option is easier for some people to look at. Other people prefer to use this advanced logic where they can just type things out. And that can be nicer if you're doing really complex logic with lots of different ands and ors and statements you want to make sure are grouped together exactly right. But the simple display is often easier when you're just putting in 1 or 2 items. I can also filter by DAG if I want to. And I can add a live filter, which is easier demonstrated than explained. Finally, I can choose what order I want the results to be in. So instead of the default order by record ID, I can order by last name. And this is obviously an extremely well filled out demo project with lots of people to filter through. But you can see it's pulling the basic information, only the fields I asked for. And then with this live filter, for any multiple choice question can be used as a live filter where I can see only people who've answered red, only people who've answered blue or white to look through my data set. REDCap also does some very basic statistics for you. So overall, and these can't be changed, but they are useful for just pulling basic information that you want to maybe pull into a report to show your progress, or just take a look at how your project data collection is going. On your text fields, you're just going to get the N and how many have missing data. Number fields is going to give you your min, max, standard deviation, percentile breakdowns, and then it will graph the numbers for you. Multiple choice fields, you'll be able to see that N again and what the breakdown is among the choices. And you can see it as a bar chart or a pie chart. And I can download that to use in a presentation or a PowerPoint. So nothing earth-shattering in terms of statistics. Like I said, it's really not trying to compete with the actual stats programs out there, but it is a quick way of seeing how the project's going and what the flavor of the data you're getting back is. A word choice that is no way influenced by the question asking about ice cream flavor being on the screen then. Exporting data, you can choose how you want to export it. So any of your major stats programs, that XML file, if you're maybe transferring it to a new server, or a CSV file. So this is what you would open in Excel. And you have 2 options here, raw data and labels. Raw data is going to pull what's stored on the server side. So you're going to get the variable name, that short name that is just a quick description of the field. You're going to get the 1, 2, 3, 4 on multiple choice, not the red, blue, green, yellow. This is what you're going to be using if you're doing analysis. If you're doing any kind of data cleaning that you plan on re-importing into REDCap, it has to be in this raw format. And generally speaking, I'd say probably 80 to 90% of the time, this is what you're going to want to look at. Labels pulls all the labels off of things instead of the actual names and data. So I don't get the variable name, I get the question last name instead of L name. I don't get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I get red, blue, green, yellow, which is fine when it's red, blue, green, yellow, but when it's 4 times a week, 3 times a week, 2 times a week, less than once a week, less than once a week, less than once a month, that gets really kind of obnoxious to deal with. And it's not something you're going to want to run analysis on. Then you can choose your de-identification. If you don't have the full data set available to you for export, some of these are going to be checked and you won't be able to change it. But I can choose to remove all tagged identifiers. I can hash the record ID so that the record ID is something completely unrecognizable when I pull it. If your record ID is an identifier, you'll always want to hash it. That said, you never want your record ID to be an identifier. 2 reasons. One is anyone who opens your project is going to see all those identifiers on the screen, which is never ideal. And the other reason is up here in the URL, it gives me information about the project. So I've got the project ID number, this report ID number, And if I was doing data entry, I would have the record ID number as well. So if my record ID is MRN, I'm saving a bunch of people's medical record numbers in my data, in my browser history, which is never a good thing, especially if you happen to be working on, say, a public device. Don't use an identifier for your record ID field, but you can hash them if you need to. You can remove your unvalidated text fields in your notes boxes. And then for your date time fields, you can remove all of them, or you can do a date shift. So this will shift every date by a random value of 0 to 364. It'll use the same value in a record, so you can still do date difference calculations and find out how long after their appointment they got sick again. But it'll be a lot harder to trace it back to an actual, trace it back to an actual calendar date. And then these over here tend to be used more outside of the US. CSV stands for comma separated variables. If you want to separate on something other than a comma, you can choose that. In the US, we usually use the period or the stop for decimals. Elsewhere, they often use commas, so you can set your numbers that way if you need to. So you choose your item. I'm going to unchoose a few of these. Export your data. And I can download my data set. So that's data in and out, and that's the basic setup of a really basic REDCap project. There are two other sets of things I want to show you how to do in REDCap before we're done today. One is using surveys. This is something that as more people are doing telehealth, as more research is moving online, surveys are becoming more and more important. So before you can use surveys in a project, you have to enable them on the project setup page. And then in the online designer, you're going to say which forms in your project you want to be surveys. So you don't have to enable everything as a survey. You can have surveys that go out to participants that they can see, and you can have regular administrative forms that are just for you and other researchers. When you enable something as a survey, you're going to give it a title. You can give it instructions. If your project has a logo, you can add it. Or if you have a departmental or university logo you want to show up at the top of the survey page, you can add it. And then you can choose if you want to use radios, standard radios and checkboxes, or enhanced. And if you have any thought that people are going to be doing this on a mobile device, I strongly recommend enhanced. Instead of just having to pick those tiny little radio buttons next to the question, you can click on the whole answer choice. So better on mobile devices, better if you're working with anyone who might have some fine motor issues, even with a regular mouse. And then you can set up the design on your project, so you can change your text size, change your font. They've got some default themes you can use, so we can have this set up to a few different colors ways, or you can customize it. Which I'm not going to do because I'm in no way a graphic designer, and I'm really quite dreadful at that sort of thing. If I go into, after I have this saved, there'll be the option to copy this, so that if I have other surveys in my project, instead of having to set all this up, the design up piece by piece in every single one, I can just use the same design in every single one with a click. Questions can be auto-numbered, or you can do your own numbering. If you're using branching or skip logic, you'll have to use custom numbering because REDCap won't know how to number hidden fields. And then you can choose if you want your questions to display all on one page or one per page, one section. If you're doing that one section, any place where there's this yellow section header, they're going to get a next or they'll get a next button. And this is really useful. It breaks your survey up so it's easier to take. And anytime they hit next, it's saving the data. So if they quit out halfway through, at least you got something. It gives you some information about them. You can set up a survey-specific email field. So this comes up a lot in parent-child or in patient-caretaker projects, where some surveys you want to go out to the patient, some you want to go out to the caregiver. You can set up email fields for each of them and then select them from a drop-down menu to say this survey goes out to the patient, whatever's entered in that patient email. This goes out in whatever's entered in that caregiver email. You can choose for any field you made required if it tells them it's required. Let's respondents see aggregate results. You can turn on text-to-speech, making the survey a lot more ADA friendly. You can set a limited number of participants. So if you only have the money to pay for 100 gift cards, you can set a hard response limit at 100 and everybody else gets a, I'm sorry, but it's closed response. You can set a time limit on when they complete. So 7 days after their invitation, or they have to complete it by November 27th. And you can choose if you want people to be able to save and return later, and whether or not they need a specialized code to do so, and if they can come back and change information they've already entered. Then finally, you're going to choose what happens at the end of the survey. If it automatically goes to the next one, redirects to a specific URL. Maybe this could take you back to your project homepage, or something that will do, comes up occasionally is, you have a survey that needs to be anonymous, but you also need their email address so that you can send them their incentive afterwards. And the way that's usually handled is to have two surveys. One that's anonymous, one where you're collecting their email. The two surveys are in no way connected. You do not know what record ID in one connects to the record ID in the other. And then you just put the link to that second survey and automatically direct them to it at the end of the first survey. Or you can just have a nice thank you for taking my survey text. Shush. So once I've got my survey enabled here, then I can figure out how I want to send it out. The first way to do it is with this public survey link. This is one link that you can send to anybody, and everybody on it can take your survey. So this is kind of what they'll see. All the questions, and I'm not sharing sound right now, or I would click so you could hear it read the questions, but the text-to-speech is enabled. You can see it's not letting me, we force that value, so I can only pick one per column. And I can still sign. So that's a public survey link. One survey you can send to absolutely everybody. By nature, it's anonymous. Everybody's coming in through the same survey link, so REDCap can't tell what record they might belong to, doesn't collect any IP information. It's completely anonymous. That's both good and bad sometimes. Another option is with this participant list. So here's where you can set it up to send a unique link to your different participants. So I can add them one per line. If I had an Excel document or a Word document with a bunch of emails, I could just copy and paste them in. And then I'm going to choose when it should be sent, now or at a specific time in the future. I can set up reminders on this. So because everybody's getting a unique link, I will know if a specific person has responded. And if they don't, I can set up a reminder to go out every 2 days, 3 times, to ask them to come back and please take my survey. You can pick emails from anybody on the project, give it a title, and then you can word your invitation here. This survey link and survey URL when you actually send the invitation, those are going to be replaced by an actual link and an actual URL that people can click on or copy paste into their browser. And then I can choose who on my email list I want to send this to. And I can see my invitation is scheduled to be sent here. In a minute it will be, or it has been sent out, but it's not off the server yet. I could also just open a link. So if I was in clinic, I could go to the person's name and just open this up as a link for them, and they'd be able to take the, I could close REDCap, always close the part where you're actually signed in, but then I could give them this survey where they don't have access to the rest of the project and they could do the data entry process. Another option, if I have an email field in my project, so let's add that in. That's going to be a text field. It just needs to say email, give it a variable name, and I'm going to validate it as an email address. Now on the project setup page, I have the option to enable that email field to send invitations to. So whatever they put in that email field will now get captured and added to the participant list. So if I sent that out as a public survey and they filled in their email, I now have that email address and I can send them unique surveys that they can fill out, and it will still be linked back to their original survey. Everything will be linked in the same record. And sometimes I don't want to have to go through and set up and manually send every single email invitation in the project. That is tedious and error prone. So I can set up automated invitations. This part's exactly the same as the composed survey invitations, but over here I can say send it when the favorite survey is complete. And I could even add something on here. So I only want this to go out if the age is greater than 45. Only a subsection of my survey participants actually need to be followed up with. I could also use a date difference calculation. So if I wanted to say, when the date difference between today and their visit date is greater than 7, send this follow-up survey. I can choose when to send it, immediately, on the next day, weekday, weekend, day of the week. I can send after a certain number of days. So maybe I want to send something to go out 7 days after date of birth, presumably going out to a parent, not to the actual child. Or I can set an exact date time. I can do those same reminders. And then I can make it active or not active. And I'm going to make it not active because otherwise I'm going to accidentally send myself a lot of invitations. But now anytime this favorite survey is filled out in a way that meets the logic I set up here, it's going to automatically send an invitation if this form is not complete. The other option in terms of getting surveys to participants is the survey queue. So for the survey queue to work, you have to have emailed them out the initial survey somehow. It doesn't matter if it was a public survey link or if it was going to be the something else, use a participant list to send the initial one, or an automated survey invitation to send the initial one. The survey queue kind of acts like a to-do list of all the surveys in the project. But it can display the surveys one after another as well, so that it's not just a constant back and forth between emails, or that auto continue all the way through, always in this order, everybody always sees everything. So I can say, using the survey queue, show my PHQ9 here, Spanish PHQ9, when the favorite survey is complete, and if age is less than 50. Only when these qualifications are met will this become available to take in the queue. And then if I choose this auto start link, as soon as they submit that favorite survey, if they're under 50, it will automatically launch this new survey. And it's a really seamless process for the participant, taking them through the list of surveys in the exact order you say they need to be filling them out. And the last part I'm going to show you in terms of setting up basic REDCap projects is longitudinal databases. So these you enable on the project setup page, and it gives you a new option here to define your events and designate instruments. So I may have 3 different visits. And I want to use the same surveys or the same forms at more than one time point. Instead of building multiple copies of all of those forms I want to use, I can say I want to use this same form multiple times. And it doesn't have to be the same with the different forms. I can put in any order for each visit. Each visit has a total unique selection of forms that I can select for it that will be available for data entry or for surveys at that time point. So if I go in to do data entry now, you can see it's listing out everything. And I could not go into the visit to here and even try and do data entry on my PHQ. It just doesn't let me. But I can go into any of the other ones. And do data entry at any of the different time points. So longitudinal projects are best used when you have a set number of time points or data sets that you want to use. So you know people are going to be coming in at 5 different visits, and they're going to want to use these forms at each of those visits. Great time to use a longitudinal setup. You can also have a visit or an event that isn't at any specific time point. It might just be administrative, or for all of the forms that you're going to do regular data entry, you're not collecting actually with a participant, for instance. It's really a very flexible way of setting up different time points or different event buckets in your project. And one other feature it gives you is once you've set up a project as longitudinal, you can enable the scheduling module. So what this does, now that I've enabled it, I need to go back and do one thing to set it up first. Now when I define my events, I can see how many days after this first event the second event's supposed to happen. So 7 days after the first event is there visit 2, and then 14 days after that first event is visit 3. And for that one, let's say plus or minus a day. Now when I go to the scheduling module, I can generate a schedule based on the information on when these events are supposed to take place for any record. And then on that calendar, it will show me when those events are supposed to happen. I can click on it and jump to the data entry forms. I can change my status, due, schedule, confirm, canceled, no show. And I can put in any extra notes that I need to here. Again, unfortunately, this doesn't export to an outside calendar. It's really just kind of a sticky note in connectivity within the project, but it's a really helpful way of seeing your entire group can then see where everything is, who's coming, what appointments, what events are coming up in the next few days or the next week or month. And it makes quick access to the record and the data entry forms that you need to be filling out at that time point. So that has been me talking pretty much nonstop for a little over an hour. Are there any questions that I can help with at this point? I know I just kind of threw a lot of information at everybody. But are there any questions or thoughts about it that I can get into?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. That's a lot to take in.
I know.
Yeah, I know we have a lot of questions. So, Crystal, if you can raise your hand and Crystal can unmute you, I think we can do it that way.
And it's totally fine if people have, can't come up with questions on the spot. Like I said, I just threw a lot of information out there in a very short time period. And I know it can take a little bit to process.
Will the recording be available later on?
Yes. Yes, we recorded it.
Maybe we'll have questions after going through the recording.
Absolutely.
Okay. I don't see any questions here right now. Crystal, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Do you see any hands raised?
Nope, there are no hands raised. There are a few things. Okay, Okay, there's no questions. It's just statements in the chat.
Okay. I mean, we did a recording, so we'll put it out there after tomorrow. And or if you can put it out there today, would that be possible?
I have a raised hand. I have a raised hand.
Okay.
Angela, I'm going to unmute you and lower your hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. I just had a quick question because like everyone said, you said it as well. It was a lot of information, but I appreciate all the information. I'm getting ready to start a multi-center study, and I was really interested in the group access part. And I wanted to be clear. So you know, the instruments that I create, basically I can give the different sites access to just those instruments. Do I have to create, my question is, I guess I want to know, do I have to like create more instruments for different sites, or the same ones can be used in, you know, basically, you know, assigning the roles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, you don't have to create a different set of instruments for every site. If there are questions that are site specific, it can get a little bit more complicated, although I have a few things that'll come up tomorrow that can help with that. But the way the data access groups work is everybody sees the same set of forms. They just don't have access to anybody else's data. So Denver only sees Denver's data entered by them and other people at Denver's site. Harvard only sees people entered by theirs. Howard only sees people in the data entered by theirs. Everybody's got the same forms. They're all entering in the same form, same variables. It just limits the data they have access to.
Okay, but I can see everybody's data.
Yep, as long as you don't put yourself in a data access group.
Right. Okay, now I have a little trick, you know, because of the different sites. Labs is always our issue when we're doing research studies, the different units and ranges and so forth. And one site is in Nigeria. So
okay.
we basically created a specific form for their labs. And so I would have to create 3 lab forms, right?
You might need to, yeah. If the actual data they're putting in is a little bit different, you might need a different form for each. And then what you can do is when you add users from each site to the project, you can just give them read-write access to their site's platform and no access to any of the other sites. So you're not seeing it.
Okay. Well, that's great to know. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from ACOB. You can unmute yourself.
The question I asked, how long is the project or data allowed to be stored in the REDCap?
So REDCap itself doesn't have any limits. That would be up to your institution if they set any limits on how long you can keep a project active. So I can't answer that one, I'm afraid.
So we don't have any limits. You can keep it as long as you want to. Yes.
Okay, we have another question from Kalu. Nima.
Hi, it's Nena. Thanks for the presentation. That was really great. We have a fillable PDF form. Can we import that form into REDCap instead of building it from scratch?
Unfortunately, you will have to build it. you can't, it doesn't have a way of reading an existing PDF and creating the fields for you. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Crystal, how soon can you send the recording?
Because the recording is so long, it may not download for like 45 minutes to an hour. It just depends on how long it takes to download. But I can send it to everyone by tomorrow morning.
Okay.
If it downloads pretty fast, then I'll send it out today.
Okay. Okay. So I think we can end it for today and pick it up tomorrow.
Great.